My name is Bart van Ark, and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board. And today I'm joined by my colleague Lynn Franco, who's our Director of Economic Indicators, to discuss our latest release of consumer confidence over the month of April 2020. Lynn, welcome to this podcast.
Good to be here.
Lynn, this is a special month. We are in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. When we released the March index last month, we already saw some impacts on that index, but obviously April is significantly worse, and we saw that reflected in today's numbers. Can you just take us quickly through what we saw in today's index?
Well, we had a 32-point decline in consumer confidence, which is the largest month-over-month decline in the history of this series. So we saw consumer confidence go from 118.8 to 86.9, and a lot of that was really prompted by sort of the bottom falling out in terms of the present situation. And we did have a little glimmer of hope in the fact that expectations, consumer short-term outlook for the next 6 months, did show a little bit of improvement.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. And before we go into the present situation expectations that you just mentioned, let's just talk about the aggregate index. You said this was the largest month-over-month decline. What are the sort of previous episodes that you saw declines of this size, less than what we saw now, but you know, a similar type of crisis?
Well, we've really got to go back to the 1970s. At that time, we were doing the index on a bi-monthly basis, so it's not exactly apples to apples. But when we had the oil crisis back in 1973, that prompted some very large drops in consumer confidence. But it's very rare to see such a sharp decline in a single month.
Yeah, so as you say, all these crises are different. I mean, this is a bit of a shock in a way. I mean, we basically just stopped the economy when this virus was hitting us. And we have had previous shocks. You know, an example of that is September 11 or the Katrina hurricane in 2005. What is the difference between the kind of shock we're experiencing today compared to the shock we were experiencing at that time?
Well, as you mentioned, you know, we've had several shocks over the decades. What makes them somewhat different is whether or not there's economic consequences. So, for instance, Katrina, we had a sharp decline in consumer confidence, but that was sort of, the impact was very localized. So generally, you know, within a month to 4 months, we bounced back. September 11th, again, it was a shock, but we were already in a recession. So it just sort of, you know, kind of catapulted consumer confidence a little further down. The same with Lehman Brothers. That was in the middle of sort of the financial crisis. We were already at recession levels, and that shocked consumers to the fact that we had the newest, lowest levels of consumer confidence ever. So this is, you know, going to play out a little bit, I think, over time, and we'll see whether or not we get a double shock, you know, if we get a second wave of the infection coming back in the fall.
Right. I think that's an important point, actually, because as you say, when Lehman happened, so the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009, we actually saw the index go down much further. You know, today's index is at 86.9. That's still relatively high because at the time of Lehman, at some point, we ended up at a record, a reading as low as 25. So there's still a very long way to go. What is the main difference between what's happening now and what was happening at that time?
Well, I think first of all, if you take a look back at the Great Recession, we peaked sometime in, I think it was July of 2007, and consumer confidence was at about 112. So sort of a much lower reading. I mean, if we just take a look in the rearview mirror here, we only have to go to February, where consumer confidence was at 132.6. So we've entered this crisis on much more solid footing, both in terms of how the economy was, in terms of expectations, in terms of the job market. We've just suffered, if you look in the last 2 months alone, confidence has declined almost 46 points. So we've really sort of compacted the decline that we saw during the Great Recessions into a much shorter time span.
Yeah, so that raises the question, how much does that now help, right? I mean, we entered this crisis at a higher level. So yes, we had tight labor markets, low unemployment, we had solid household balance sheets. That's great to enter a crisis like this. But then the speed by which it came down, I mean, the question is, does it provide us any cushion about 2 months later?
Well, it may. I think this is somewhat different in the fact that this is a health crisis. So there is
Mm.
sort of a fear factor at play here. It's not just about, the loosening of restrictions or the economy reopening. I mean, those are critical as well, and that's what's led to this little bump up that we've seen in expectations. But there's also a fear factor, and I think, we haven't seen the full effect, at least economically, of of COVID-19. So we could be sort of on a bumpy roller coaster ride for the next couple of months at least.
Yeah, so let's unpack the index now a little. You have the present situation, which is essentially looking at consumers' current assessment of business conditions and the labor market, and then you have the expectations, which we'll talk about a little later. But let's first focus on this present situation because that was the biggest collapse we've ever seen. 90 points. It came down from 167 to 76. What makes this so special, this crisis and this very rapid decline to anything that we've seen before?
We've never seen anything like this before. This is about 3 times the magnitude of other collapses that we've seen in the present situation. But we've never faced a situation like this before where we've had sort of a complete shutdown in business activity. And that's clearly reflected in the decline that we see in how consumers assess, current business conditions. We've had millions upon millions of people filing unemployment claims. So that's really also impacted consumers' perspective of the job market. So this sort of, putting the brakes on the economy has also put the brakes on consumer confidence.
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, there are now some thoughts around that 1/3 of the U.S. labor force may see their jobs impacted one way or another, either by losing their jobs or being furloughed, and probably even larger category of workers that will see their incomes being cut, either through salary cuts and things like that, or through the underperformance of stock markets. So this is going to impact their income conditions certainly as well. Now, if we look forward over the next couple of months, that's kind of interesting too. So there we're asking three things. We're asking again, what are your prospects for business conditions and for employment conditions? But we'll also ask them about their income prospects. And as you said at the top of this podcast, you said, well, that improved a little bit by 7 points. It actually came down in March quite significantly. So expectation weakened in March, but then in early April, we see it come up a little. That feels a little strange, doesn't it? And what is it that drives consumers to begin to think that actually things may get better?
It's a little strange, but a little expected in the sense that, with an economy that's really sort of put the brakes on now as we begin to loosen up, if we begin to, reopen and see a little bit of activity, that does give consumers a little bit of glimmer of hope, right? It's almost like how much worse can things get?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's why I think we see an improvement in business conditions and we see an improvement in employment. However, where we don't see an improvement is in consumers' income expectations. So even though restrictions may loosen, the economy may reopen, we have consumers that are very tentative. In fact, we've got the pessimists outnumbering the optimists in terms of the income outlook. That's only happened once before. That was during the Great Recession. And prior to that, it had never happened in the 50-plus history of the survey.
Yeah, and this really shows that this crisis is moving itself from a supply shock. When we talked about shocks before, we basically had to stop the economy because essentially a non-economic event forced us to basically close down a very significant part of the economy. And that supply shock may now gradually turn itself into a demand problem, because once we're gradually coming out of this, the question is, how do we come out of it? Do people come out with it in getting back to their jobs very quickly? Do they see their salaries being restored and the household balance sheets being improving? And that's sort of what I seem to be feeling, might hopefully happen. So, of course, we all hope that that's going to happen. We call this at the conference board a typically V-shaped type of recovery. You go deep, and then, of course, you start to recover again. And this can go on for quite a while. But what are the uncertainties down the road, in your view, that may disappoint consumers and therefore perhaps impact the expectations and the present situation assessment in the future?
Well, first, I'd just like to even point out that we're already seeing some of this, demand weakness. We ask a variety of other questions in the survey. So we ask consumers if they're going to, purchase an auto in the next 6 months, a home, or major appliances. And we've seen those three decline over the last month, so that you can see that, consumers are becoming tentative. Any big ticket item, durable items are sort of being put on the shelf and postponed. Whether that leads to pent-up demand or not still remains to be seen. We've seen their vacation intentions really astronomically plummet, so that, they're sort of in this stay-at-home mode, and that's probably going to persist, given the fear factor until there's some sort of treatment for COVID-19. And then the wild card in all of this is what happens if we have a second wave, as a lot of experts had said in the fall. I mean, that could sort of also be the Lehman in this COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, by the Lehman, you mean that it could go much further down, as it did at the time, as we discussed earlier, than it currently is.
Absolutely.
It still has a long way. It could still go much further down if there are these disappointments.
It could, and we're not out of the woods yet. We have not seen the full economic consequences yet of COVID-19. And I think as, things begin to open up a little bit, if we see infection rate spikes, that could cause a little bit of concern around, consumers, especially in terms of their expectations, could impact their spending. So I think we're going to have a little bit of a roller coaster ride over the next several months until the outlook becomes a bit clearer.
Yeah, so we're not done yet. That's basically what is saying. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other breakdowns we're doing. One is age by households. So we're breaking it down in under 35, 35 to 54, and 55 over. We do see some differences there. Perhaps, again, not surprising that the older age category, 55 and over, has become more negative than the younger age categories, right?
Absolutely. I mean, even though the declines have been very broad-based, but when you get to the 55 and over, confidence is about 10, 12 points less than under 35. And I think part of this also, not only do we have the health crisis, but also let's take a look back just a month or two. We've also suffered some pretty significant declines in terms of financial assets. So this could have obviously impacted wealth for these households, which are more likely to be invested in the stock market than their younger counterparts.
Yeah, and you also see that in the incomes. It's kind of interesting. When you look at the incomes, you see indeed there's a big negative group between sort of $15,000 and $25,000. Those are people basically, live from paycheck to paycheck, and obviously they're hugely hurt. But then the declines also tend to be fairly large, over 125,000, and those are probably the people who are much more impacted by the stock markets.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what's interesting here is that, we had finally sort of closed the gap between the tale of two consumers, sort of the affluent and the non-affluent. And now, once again, we're sort of widening the gap.
Yeah. So the impact of COVID-19 across the United States is quite different. Obviously, we have hotspots like New York and some other places in the United States, and some other states actually have gone, everybody's been impacted, but relatively unscathed through this. Do you see differences between regions or between states in terms of consumer confidence?
Well, I think what's interesting is despite there being hot pockets, and obviously those areas are doing a little less favorably or poorly than others, we have seen sharp declines in consumer confidence across the board. But as you said, New Yorkers and Californians are suffering the most. They have the lowest levels of consumer confidence there. And in those areas, we've even seen declines in the present situation exceeding 100 points. So we are seeing pockets of weakness, and also we're seeing some pockets of weakness, for instance, in some of the states and areas that rely on the oil industry as well, because that's also been impacted by COVID-19.
Yeah, so there's a lot in this data. So, when we look at consumer confidence, we partly look at what does it mean for the economy. We also partly try to really understand what it means for consumer spending. You already identified some of these consumer categories earlier. When we look at the recovery and we work with various scenarios at the conference board, we look at sort of, more V-shaped or more U-shaped type of recoveries. Consumption is by far the most important part of that. What, in your view, is the thing that we really need to look at now from this index in terms of better understanding how consumer spending over the next few months may play out?
I think we particularly need to keep an eye on consumers' assessment of income over the next couple of months. If they become more negative about their financial outlook, that means they're more likely to curb spending. So I think that's going to be key too. And also we'll see how some of these hard hit areas in terms of, hospitality, travel, a lot of the hard hit areas, to see if there's any signs of a rebound there that may give consumers a little bit of comfort as well.
Yeah. So all in all, there's a hope that things will get better, but at the same time, there's also an amount of realism in where we're looking at these data to say that this is probably not the end of it yet, and that we may see more pressure on consumer confidence in going forward. Lynn Franco, thank you much for joining us today, and we'll talk again next month when the next iteration of the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index is going to appear. Thanks for joining us.